Well, hello and welcome to today's video. This is the third one in a string that I really kind of got off on a tangent with this a little bit, just kind of the way life does it. The first one was on architecture of comparing, for instance, the power over Ethernet wired cameras that are running all the time versus wired but wireless data type of cameras versus battery operated, for all intents and purposes, glorified trail cams. And today we're going to look at the video itself. We're going to talk a little bit about the video itself so we can set our expectation. The second video was on, what did we do that on? We did that on how to multi-zone, how to take advantage of the architecture of a specific system made by Anchor or Eufy. I'm not associated or affiliated with them. I get nothing for it. So I'm not bad-mouthing them or talking them up. I'm just talking factually about how their architecture seems to be in my experience with it. Today, we're going to look at those video qualities and aspects of that. Roll, title, roll. All right, so what am I going to beat around here? I'm going to beat around the bush to try to explain something to help you set your expectations. Now, a little bit of a hazy or noisy picture that gives you information is better than complete darkness, correct? So that's kind of where we're going. We're coming from no information to something that gives us a little bit of information. And some research a few years back, maybe a decade by now, I've lost track of it, was showing how little information does our human mind require to draw a picture and have the idea communicated. What it started out with, I think it was like 4 squares, or maybe it was 16, or, in a shape, and they just kept cutting that box size down further and further until eventually we were able to determine that the picture was of Abraham Lincoln, because we already knew something in our mind and we just had to fit it to what that little graphic represented. So we don't really need ultimate fine level of, let's call it full HD type of imagery to get the information. Now, the thing is, what does it take to get full HD, and what is HD? Because in our minds, we're used to that super sharp image. And really, the HD and all, a lot of these things are basically the frame rate, how big of a picture. It's not really guaranteeing you the quality and independence of every little pixel in that picture or in that raster image. It's not really telling us that. But in our minds as consumers, when we hear full HD or HD or 2K, we're expecting an extremely clear picture. Because that's why we want the bigger pictures, right? We knew from the old days if we took a little picture and blew it up, it just got grainy. So nowadays, the consumer, when they hear 2K or 4K or HD, we're expecting more clarity, more bits, more imagery, more refinement in the picture. And that's not really what we get with a security camera. And given our architecture, it may not be reasonable, because if we're back to not having a premises wiring of Ethernet and constantly running live cameras all at one time that don't have to be triggered, that can trail the time and date stamp across them with every single frame that we see, every single second that we see, which would actually be 30 frames if we're full. That is different than if we're trying to make use of batteries, because batteries run down. They have to be charged up. So we're going to have to do something. We talked about that in the architecture. We're going to have compromises. We're going to rob Peter to pay Paul. What you pay for to get a simpler installation to say complete wireless, battery only, and then Wi-Fi back, we're going to have compromises. And that's what we're going to talk about here. So let's look at this. This is a still I have made up so I can run my mouse over. And what we're going to look at is what I would call full HD. In my mind, my connotation, full HD, what I expect for full HD is going to be 30 frames per second in 1920 by 1080. That to me is full HD. Now, to get this, we see that we're running 16 megabits per second to stream that. If we're going to stream that, this is using H.264. compression. This was shot with that, but we produced 16 megabits per second data rate total with the audio and video together to get that picture, and 30 frames per second. So we're getting 30 changes of actual images flashed before our eyes in a second, which gives us a much smoother look. It gives us a more fluid look. That's why we like the 60 frames per second, because it gives even more fluid look. And our cameras, if they can capture a clear image, still image one at a time, we shouldn't get any of the motion blur that we're used to. That's kind of what we're looking at here. We'll look at the audio rate. It's running at 256 kbps. And the sample rate, that gets into the analog to digital conversion rates at 48K. But this is really kind of what we expect when we hear that magic word, full HD. Now, when we think about it, and we're going back to, say, Netflix and some of the other big streaming platforms that we've had through the years, we've gotten used to still a very, very good picture. It's not running 16K bps. It's running something much slower, and it's using a type of compression, and still 16 megabits a second. That's pretty fast. Most of us, if we remember when we signed up for our Hulu or Netflix, whatever, they would say something like, well, you got to have a minimum of 3 megabits per second for your system. And if it got fast enough, if the unit you're watching on is smart enough and fast enough, it will test the other speeds and say, yeah, I can actually sustain that bit rate. And so we might go up in resolution, or it may change how it's actually being compressed in there to get a full frame. Because remember, they're locked into a kind of frame rate, whatever it is, and drawing that many bit patterns. So if it can't pull each one of them independently, it's going to have to interpolate and fill it in, right? And it may not have had that resolution native. Anytime you have a camera sensor that isn't full native 1080, then it's not going to be able to produce an actual true image. It's going to produce something that is pretty close. That's kind of what we have with security cameras. We don't necessarily need a movie quality image to be useful to us for security. We just don't. It would be nice, and we have that expectations if we go in uninformed because somebody tells us it's 1080. Well, that ought to be really sharp and clean and good. But it isn't necessarily sharp, clean, and good. Let's get back over to that picture. So this is kind of that full thing, 30 frames per second, 16 megabits per second for the stream on this. And then when we come over here to the eufy, this one is 1920 by 1080. This one is the 2C camera. This is a video shot off 2C camera, and this is the 2C Pro. Okay, and the difference between the 2C with the color is the model had a little LED in it, so it could do a little spotlight. And I thought it was pretty much useless because it's a tiny LED run off a battery, and it's just not very bright. But it was different than the 2 series of cameras. So here we have the 1080 frame, the frame size, frame width and height, 1080, 1920. This one is 1080, 1920. Compare the bit rate. This is basically half a megabit per second. It's less than half a megabit per second because it's 5485 compared to 16,000 kilobits. So this is 485 kilobits. This is 16 million kilobits, I guess. So now we look at this is also half the frame rate. This is half the frame rate. So here we're getting 30 a second, 15 and 15. So we expect to see more blur off of a lower frame rate. That lower frame rate, you're going to have a bigger jump between motion and motion. If you're throwing a baseball, it's going to look like a blur to our eyes. We can still detect the motion. We can still know that something's coming across the screen, but we really won't get a clean image. So the faster we do cut them up, the more frames per second. You've seen these high speed cameras where we can really slow stuff down. It's because there's a lot of frames and we can take it at that small interval of time. So we go back to looking at our video, we're not going to get this kind of quality. Hey, appreciate you watching. Do me a favor, if you will, subscribe to the channel, either the YouTube or the Rumble channel, which this appears in. And if you can, check the notification bell or settings to make sure that you get notified when new videos are posted. Appreciate it. So we go back to looking at our video. We're not going to get this kind of quality, and even in Netflix and our streaming, we didn't get quite this quality. If you look at the backgrounds are actually dithered out a little bit. They're kind of blurred out a little bit, and they would be with an analog camera given the f-stop. So here we see 2C Pro 15 and 15. Look at the audio rate. Compare these audio rates. What is your audio quality going to do comparing the security camera to, say, the more cinematic production? 48K sampling rate, 256 kbps on the bit rate for the audio compared to 22. So that's about, roughly, in your head, a tenth of the bit rate. So it's not going to be very clear. We have two channels, one channel, and 16K. So we can see that the audio quality is going to be much lower with these cameras in this production, and we're going to see that it's actually much lower on the data rate. So we're going to have, obviously, we're not going to get full HD cinematic quality because we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the frame rate. And that gets back to this comment that we were talking about on the architecture. If I'm power over Ethernet and wired, I do have the capacity to run really nice, clean pictures all the time, running the time and date stamp across the picture on each frame rate as they come out. So that's every 30 frames we stamp it on there, and we change it every 30 frames, but we just keep that clock running, and it's just reprinted in exactly the same spot every frame until the data changes. Well, that's nice and that's good, but it takes constant power. With something that we're trying to come in after we've built a building and add some cameras to, and we want the flexibility maybe to change their positions because, you know, it's just a little bit better, or we're trying to escape a bush, maybe we have to start doing things like those activity zones to try to cut stuff out. But we still have to run that system. We have to be able to trigger it, usually with PIR instead of AI. AI normally is going to take a feed to the server, or the AI has to be built into the camera, so that motion detection initially has to be triggered by something, and it would have to run all of the time for the AI to be able to process those images to give you your motion detection. So most of these little cameras, trail camera based, are going to work off of PIR, passive infrared, which is going to take a little bit of time for the infrared sensor to pay attention that, hey, it's seeing some motion. Is it genuine real motion, or is it noise? Yes, if it's really genuine motion, then we have to trip the camera to tell it to start recording, and we have to start compositing our image. And we'll look at some video of that, and we'll talk about the compression. We'll see the compression. We've already talked a little bit about how little data is actually in that 1080p picture. So, you know, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to get all nutty about 1080 if they're not a full bit rate to support that large of a format of a raster or a pixel map. So let's get to that. All right, what I've got here is some nighttime shots from the eufy cam, and we're going to look at how it behaves. Now, with nighttime information, with this type of photograph, as it takes that image, there's really not a lot of differentiation it can make in those in the picture, and so we're going to have some additional problems that we may have depending on the camera and the lighting situation, the exposure that it can have. Now, when we watch this, I'm going to turn this on, and you will see the deer walk, and you'll start to see ghosting, that what I call ghosting, as the deer walks across. Also, I want to point out something else. We'll replay it, and then we'll look at some daytime, some color shots, and we'll talk about that so we really get a good picture of it. Also, once we do this a little bit, I'm going to pop a picture to really show what we're doing, I think, in the compression. So are you ready? Let's hit it. Now do you see how this little bit of deer has been left behind on the image? You can even see the back legs. Let's run that over again. Okay, run her back. All right, when she walks, watch, because the camera has at least scanned this at one point in time when it takes its little readings. So here she goes. There it is. You see her little butt dragging. You see that, and you can see a little bit of that back leg right in there as it decompresses. And if we watch it several times, we may see that it's not doing exactly the same thing every single time. See, this is a little bit different. It's how it's processing the minimal information that it has. Now it kind of clears up at the end, and we get this failure of the system right here, given that bottom line. But what we can see in this picture is the little lines, the little blocks. Here's a little block. Let me blow it back up again. Maybe that will help, even though I lose my area. Do you see this little line, this little box? They're doing some compression in that, or expansion actually in this case when it's bringing it back up. And we see we got a blurry box and a blurry box and a blurry box and a blurry box, and we see some defined lines in between of data, and they can run both horizontal or vertical. Mostly they look like they run vertical, but we see that we don't really have 1080 or 1920 or whatever advertised independent pixels here. We end up having this big blob because it's got to do something. It's got to do something because it doesn't have 16 megabits per second to actually write those individual dots. So you get compromised right off of the bat. And if we go to another video, let me see if I can bring it up now. All right. Now this does a pretty good job, at least on my benefit here, because you can't really see just how many spider webs are hanging off. It's about time to have to hose this back porch back off and clean her up. But what I want to show you on this particular video is I want you to pay attention to the first 6 seconds of this, because remember, we have a lot to do in that camera using this battery operated architecture, and anybody's battery operated architecture. We've got to be asleep to save the battery or to charge it while we're doing nothing, that kind of thing, if it's daylight and we have sunlight above us on our solar panel. So we've got to do our passive infrared, notice that there's something moving, verify that it's moving with a little bit of a time so that we know that we're not just nuisance tripping, making sure it's actual movement, then start the camera, wake the camera up, start the camera, and start building our image. And it's probably better to work out filling an image in, especially the background areas that we're not particularly interested because we're not really seeing a great deal of motion. It's probably good if we concentrate on the thing moving, right? So we don't want to be overly critical on how the system works. And the idea is, can we tell what's going on here? And I'm going to show you that video, and you tell me if you could tell, even as kind of grainy or pixelated or dithering as it does, how valuable it is that you can still see what's going on. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring that back, and I'll hit play, and I want you to watch how it fills in the little squares, and it takes about 6 seconds in daylight, I notice, for it to do, which would be 6 times the 15 frames per second for it to work out that in the compression or scheme in order to get us a good picture. So let's go ahead and put play, and I want you to watch one more thing. I call it a heartbeat. You'll see a heartbeat every second, so to speak. So it looks like every 15 frames, every second, it's like it's going back and recovering the old ground and filling things back in that it might have been assuming had no movement in the compression to kind of redraw that background. So let's bring that back one more time, and we're hitting go right now. See it? Do you see? Finally, it's kind of cleared up. And now we see the pulse rate. Concentrate over here in the area of the green or some other area that you can see a definite. But when we look in these areas and even up here against the white, watch, you can see it being very blurry, and it starts to sharpen up. It takes about 6 seconds before it kind of fills in, and we can roll it back to see that. Boom. Now he walks away. Now what can we tell from this? This is, by the way, this is also a 2C camera. This is one that was at the road. We brought it back. We're only half the frames per second. That's a compromise, and we really are not up to a full 1080 type of native image. And if we had it on our sensor, we couldn't transmit it and still get it into the system at 16 megabits per second. We might get 3 and be a much cleaner, better picture at 30 frames per second. But now remember, we're handling up to 16 different cameras. Perhaps they could have had a scheme that was a little smarter than this, that each camera could throttle back down in the compression, start with the maximum bandwidth it could take. Because remember, these are working from asleep to awake, to checking the stream, to connecting to the home base, starting the stream going, and the home base has to catch what it's pushing, so it has to negotiate that. But if it had better quality at the start and another camera kicked in, perhaps they could chunk it down into lesser bit rates. Now, to do that, the cameras have to be faster and smarter than what it appears that they are, but still we get pretty good video. Now let's go back and look at that 1 second readjustment. I see this in a lot of Chinese technology on these battery operated cameras. Let's switch that back, and I'm going to play it from about that 10 seconds on, and just watch kind of the green area. If you can see it, watch how about every 15 frames or so, about once a second, it like resets it to a different, and there's really nothing going on down here. It's just the blurry spots move from one space to the next because the next set of math calculations as it decompresses draws it a little bit different. When I was talking about if the camera's sitting there asleep, nothing's going on, and it needs to detect motion over a period of time to say, yeah, that's genuine motion, we're going to turn the camera on. We turn the camera on, where are we at in that process? Because obviously it can't predict motion, it has to actually see motion and then notice that motion go on for a period of time before it considers it a valid, else you get a lot of noise. Watch when the young man walks up. We can see over here in this picture, we can see he's already at the point of dropping the package off, which means he was probably picked up around this area, walked on the concrete, maybe cut through a little bit, but we have motion in this area all the way to this position before the camera cuts its first image. Okay? That's why we lose some of the initial movement sometimes. It has to know it's there. We'll go ahead and watch it one more time. Now we see if he walks on the sidewalk on the way back, he probably walked on the sidewalk coming there. And you see about how long it takes for him to move from that position. So we're losing some time, and we have to. We're on batteries. We're robbing Peter to pay Paul. We're getting a clean, simple, easy installation that comes at the cost of clarity of video and, of course, some of the reaction time, because it's not videoing 100% of the time. The Nest cams, when I was on the video on architecture, because they're a wired cam always uploading, like the Power or Ethernet, we can do that. We can not miss out on triggering because it's recording all the time. We can simply put a timestamp when we've determined that movement is very real and it's happening. We can go ahead and trigger it, but because we captured it anyway, it's still available for us to back up, say that 15 or 30 or 45 frames. We can back up because we know how long it takes, how long our period is. Once we say, yes, we have movement, we can back it up for that time and say it started here because we know we have the movement. We can back it up because we already have those frames. With a battery camera, we can't do that. We have to run forward in time. Now say it starts, now wait the camera. So we will tend to always lose a little bit of that on the front. Plus we may have to negotiate the communication with the base station because it's asleep. Everything's asleep waiting for something to happen. Camera comes on, does this a little bit, has to negotiate that. So we do lose a little bit on the front end with a battery operated camera. It's a trigger speed. And if we're getting notification, obviously it has to be processed, sent up another time up to the cloud to tell us, hey, go look at that video. All right, this is a little different, but it may be unique to eufy. But we see up here in this picture, we see the time and date stamp right up at the edge of where I've got it black framed out. So we have this up in this area. We see the October. When does this come in? Again, if we have a wired camera like the PoE, we know that it can run, and with every frame start its count and say, okay, I'm putting the clock on, and when the text changes, it changes, but it's just rewriting that time stamp on every single frame. That's not the way this particular system works. This is a eufy. If I step it back one frame or so, boom, it disappears. Okay, so it took, let's go in here, was it 1.12? Boom, there it is for that time to show up. So I'm not actually getting, if I wanted to take a still, a frame shot, a screen capture of this, it would not carry the data with it because it's not being put on there until after it pretty well much clears up that background activity. Okay, so let's just wrap this up. I think I've probably got enough minutes of video here to make an episode. Next video, we will look at some problems with eufy's apps that are currently here, and we're going to compare a little bit for when it works and when it doesn't work, and what I think we've got a problem, where I think we have a problem, and maybe eufy will see this and get on the stick and fix it because it's quite annoying and it kind of breaks down the whole value of the entire project up to this date, what they got going on, and it will probably make it worse as time goes on. So they need to put some welly in it and get her done. Now, what do we learn from this? Well, don't expect any battery operated cam, to my knowledge, is going to give you the quality of video that we naturally and inherently think of when we hear 1080, because HD, or however they might want to phrase it, if we don't have the frame rate and the compression is overly done, if we're not really having a good clean native sensor to start with, the information is never there anyway. But they could get it maybe closer towards 3 megabits per second or 1.5 megabits per second and get a much more pleasurable, usable, clear image if they could upscale that bit rate. Use a little bit more bandwidth, people, and give us a product, a final product that we can use as good quality evidence in any kind of prosecution or whatnot. It helps. And we see that we got a package delivered, or that was a deer and not a dog or a horse. Of course. We can do that. So it still has value, but it can be improved and needs to be improved. But it sure is convenient to be able to just put 2 screws on the wall, screw in a little plastic base, and hang a camera there, and just every so many months charge that sucker up, and still have the confidence that we're not completely blind and naked out in the woods. I hope that helped. Appreciate you watching. Stay tuned for that next video. It'll be up next week. Thank you.